Welcome to your online lecture for Chapter 3. In this online lecture, we'll look at the book of Genesis from the methodologies that you looked at in the previous chapter, particularly the literary and the historical lenses, or the literary and historical methods. Remember, this online lecture does not in any way replace reading this chapter. It's a summary and a snapshot, but certainly not as exhaustive as your textbook is. So I encourage you to read the textbook for this chapter. When we look at the structure of the book of Genesis from a literary perspective, we see that in chapters 1 and 2 is the account of the creation of the universe, or rather the accounts of the creation of the universe. In chapters 3 to 11, we have the origins of human communities, and chapter 12 to 50, the beginnings of the people set apart. The focus narrows from the entire cosmos to Abraham and Sarah, and then begins to widen again. One of the first things I invite you to do whenever we look at a book in the Bible is to consider its structure. The structure of the work indicates very strongly its genre, and therefore how it's meant to be read. Remember, I used the analogy before about seeing the Bible as a library filled with all sorts of literature. And so if we pay attention to its structure and therefore genre, we can read it accordingly. The consensus in biblical studies is that there are, in fact, two creation accounts in Genesis. The first account you find in chapter 1, verse 1, to chapter 2, verse 4a. Just a note, whenever you see 4a or 4b, a letter A or B, that indicates the first half, roughly, of the verse, or the second half, B, of the verse. So the first account is patterned as 6 days of creation, followed by a 7th day on which the Creator rests. Then there is a transitional statement, that's chapter 2, verse 4b, that sums up the first account and the second. I strongly encourage you to read chapter 1 and 2 of Genesis. That will give you, even a very basic level, two different accounts. You'll see that there are two themes, two styles, and two ways of telling a similar story. So take the time to read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis. The second account, which you find chapter 2, verses 4b to verse 25, focuses on the origins of humanity and other living creatures. You'll notice on this slide, as well as the previous slide, that there are two different depictions by artists of the creation. One more methodical and mystical, the other one with God in the garden with Adam and Eve. So if we compare the elements of the two creation narratives side by side, this is what can be revealed. In Genesis 1, the outline is as follows. The order of creation is light, heaven, earth, vegetation, sun, moon, stars, sea creatures, birds, land animals, and humanity. The creation of humanity is one act. Both male and female are created simultaneously. Creation is preceded by watery chaos and begins with the waters being divided. The Creator is referred to as Elohim, or God. When you compare Genesis chapter 2 with chapter 1, we see that the earth is the stage. The creation of humanity precedes vegetation and plant life. The creation of man and woman are separate acts. Creation is preceded with dry desert and begins with the land being watered. The Creator is referred to as Yahweh, or Lord God. When you compare the two narratives side by side, it's easy to see how the two are different. When we compare style, we can see glaring differences. Genesis chapter 1 is carefully choreographed. Days are numbered and each day follows a pattern. Each act of creation results in a pair of opposites. The creation of the setting and characters are carefully balanced. Creation is orderly but not static. There is a process within it, but it does not require periodic divine intervention. When we look at Genesis chapter 2, the style has a narrower focus, story rather than description. Everything takes place at once. There's no ordering, no balance, no symmetry. There's spontaneity in the account, with the Creator in experimental processes. Tensions are quickly established, not to eat from the tree, and the need for companionship. Woman created to ease second tension, but first tension continues on. Here too, based on style, when we compare the two accounts, we see some stark differences. So perhaps you grew up learning that there was only one creation narrative, or that the one creation narrative was a blending of, in fact, two creation narratives. This begs the question, why? The textbook authors suggest that it's not to say that one is correct and the other is incorrect. It emphasizes the importance of the cosmic origins. In other words, something as important as how did everything come to be deserves at least two stories to explain. Perhaps the two accounts provide for a broader perspective, which reflects the ambiguity in trying to speak of such a basic mystery. It provides a balanced view of the Creator, austere and distant, ordered and harmonious in Genesis chapter 1, and in comparison in Genesis chapter 2, a God that is intimate and casual and even spontaneous. For biblical scholars, the two creation narratives are evidence that the editor or editors of the final version of Genesis used at least two sources. Biblical scholars posit the document hypothesis, which explains there are four sources in the first 5 books of the Bible, also known as the Pentateuch. The four sources are J for Yahwist, E for Elohist, P for priestly, and D for Deuteronomistic, 3 of which are evident in Genesis. This graphic shows the distribution of materials of the 4 different sources. What's new here is the letter R, or redactor. The redactor is the editor or editors who compiled the sources. A way of understanding the redactor is you writing a term paper. In that term paper, you would have cited, let's say, 3 or 4 or 5 different sources, but in between the glue that binds all of the different citations is your own voice. You are the redactor in that case. The source critic applies the methodology called source criticism in order to find each of those different sources in your writing and your own voice, which is the redactor's voice. A redaction critic is particularly concerned with your unique hand. Let's consider for a moment the historical background of the book of Genesis. Genesis emerges from the ancient Near East and a people or tribe in that region. Many ancient peoples developed creation accounts throughout the world. These could be seen as statements about the meaning of the cosmos. The Babylonian creation epic, known as the Enuma Elish, share common motifs with the Genesis chapter 1 account. Table 3.1 in your textbook shows and compares and contrasts the differences and similarities between the two accounts. Ultimately, the Israelite stories reinforce the world-affirming optimism and humanitarianism characteristic of the Torah traditions. I'd like you to consider for a moment the influence of the Babylonian Empire. Babylon would have been the New York of the time, the big city that set style and trends and was the dominant culture. Whether we like it or not, Canadian pop culture is often governed by outside popular cultures and forms and styles set and made in other places, perhaps like New York or big cities in Canada like Toronto. We can't help but being influenced by a majority society. And so, this helps us think about the influence that Babylonian culture would have had on Jewish or early tribal Jewish culture. Just as we can't escape the pop music of America, the Jews would have not been able to escape the Babylonian style and influences in its time. Now we've come to our second and third discussion questions. The first being, what do you make of the creation accounts? Do you believe that, or do you buy the argument that there are 2 creation accounts based on style and outline alone? Or do you still see that there is one unified creation account? If you see that there is only one creation account, how do you explain the differences in style, in outline, and in other features? And the final question, scholars who emphasize the parallels between the creation account in Genesis 1 and the Babylonian creation epic note the similarities in Table 3.1. Other scholars claim the similarities have been overemphasized and fundamental differences overlooked. What do you think? Do you think we're overemphasizing the similarity between Genesis and the Babylonian creation epic? Let's look at another story in the book of Genesis, the Tower of Babel story, an old story that tries to explain why it is that we have different languages and different cultures in the world. Take a moment now and pause the video to read the narrative for yourself. When we look at the structure of the story, there's an antithetical parallelism. In other words, it starts with a unified situation and it ends with disunity. This is also reflected in the contrasting dialogues in verses 2 to 4, which describes what the humans proceed to do, with verses 5 to 8, which describes how the Lord turned their work aside. Notice as well poetic devices. In its original Hebrew, there's much alliteration in sound play, and so when it's translated into English, we lose a lot of that alliteration. In terms of the setting, we find ourselves in Babylon, an awesome city, the New York of the time. Pause the video now, take a moment and read the narrative from the Babylonian creation narrative, the Enuma Elish. These are ancient tablets that contain the Enuma Elish story. Each of them range in size from your hand to your palm. On it is written cuneiform, a language of the ancient Babylonians. Biblical scholars find three possible parallels to this passage from the Enuma Elish to the Tower of Babel story. The first being the making of the tower itself for the gods, with a determination to build the tower in rebellion to God. The second similarity is the lofty elevation of its peak to heaven. The final similarity is probably the most interesting, and that's the grammatical construction of the term making of the bricks. A way of understanding this is by comparing American English with Canadian English. For example, there are different words that exist in a Canadian English dictionary versus an American English dictionary. In a Canadian English dictionary, for example, you would find the term double-double. Some linguists even note differences in phrases that we use. In Canada, for example, we prefer to say, "do you have?" Whereas in America, it's much more preferable to say, "have you got?" And so when we look at the Tower of Babel story in Genesis, we find this interesting phrase, making of the bricks, which is distinctively Babylonian. Many biblical scholars see this as clear evidence of influence of the Babylonian story to the Tower of Babel story in the Genesis book. When a historian looks at Genesis chapter 1 to 11, he or she cannot talk about history in a journalistic sense when looking at those chapters. There is no clear evidence that any of the stories we find in Genesis chapter 1 to 11 are historical, again in the journalistic sense. Rather, for many, the stories in Genesis chapters 1 to 11 seem to be trying to answer basic questions about why things are as they are. The stories are etiology. They explain the origin of something. Most biblical scholars from most of the Christian denominations would see it in this light. There are few Christian denominations that read the Bible literally and therefore would not find this as an etiology, but rather historical and in a journalistic sense. We turn our attention now to Genesis chapter 12 to 50. Here we center in on the lead characters in the ensuing drama. In Genesis chapter 12, the theme of promise is presented. It is woven in the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs of the people of Israel, namely Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Joseph. The theme of promise is renewed, endangered, and reaffirmed in an intricate web of scenes. In this chapter, you find a variety of literary analyses of different stories in the book of Genesis. I invite you to read at least one of those literary analyses. Pay attention to the language, the form, what are the elements that it's referring to in the story itself. And then from a faith perspective, or even a secular one, I invite you to think about what's the meaning of the story for you, or what's the lesson that you can take out of the story using the analysis of that story. So what can we say in terms of the historicity of Genesis chapters 12 to 50? The narratives in Genesis 12 to 50 seem more characteristic of ordinary human experience than those encountered in the prehistory. There's no direct evidence, however, that the Israelite patriarchs and matriarchs ever existed. Archaeological data, however, does support the marriage and inheritance customs shown in the narratives. Finally, there is evidence in Bronze Age society in Mesopotamia and the Levant of a peoples called the Habiru or Apiru. There is a possible connection to the Hebrew people. It is difficult to specifically date the ancestor narratives within the Bronze Age, that is 3600 to 1200 BCE. However, based on archaeological evidence, a pastoral nomadic culture could be dated to the late Bronze Age, that's 1500 to 1200 BCE. Ultimately, the questions of the historical origins will persist as evidence is lost in the sands of time. For now, we can assume some of the ancestors of Israel and their stories are remembered in the Genesis narratives. This question is not found in your discussion questions or the forum question for the week. However, I think it's a good candidate for a test question. Some readers take Genesis chapters 1 to 3 literally, as description of actual events, while others assume it to be a myth or something like a myth. What difference does such a decision make for the contemporary relevance of the story? If you are a person of faith, I strongly suggest that you turn to your Christian tradition's method of interpreting the Bible. As well, if you belong to another faith community, you might also consult how Bible stories such as this should be interpreted.